The new associate caught me on a Tuesday morning, crouching next to the supply cabinet, wrestling a stuck drawer. It was 7:48, and he leaned down and said, "You're Ray, right? The guy who used to run the training program?" Past tense, like I was some retired mascot nobody had bothered to update the record on. I straightened and smiled. "My name is Ray Caldwell, 55 years old, 16 years with Quanta Peak Solutions, and at that moment I was apparently just the guy who used to run training." He chuckled like he'd made a clever observation. He hadn't 16 years. Not just running a training department, but building the company's entire human infrastructure from nothing. Hiring protocols, onboarding frameworks, leadership assessment systems, compliance certification pipelines. I wrote the first employee handbook when we still had fewer than 60 people and the CEO kept forgetting the Wi-Fi password. I designed the performance review system that 3 other companies in our vertical quietly copied and called original methodology. None of that fit on a quarterly report. None of it showed up as a clean bar graph. But when something broke, when morale soured or a key hire quit or a lawsuit appeared, my phone was always the first to ring. People development. Most executives treated it like a utility closet. I stopped expecting recognition around year 5. That was also when the jokes started. Ray's a lifer. Don't mess with Caldwell. He's got everyone's performance reviews. Let them think I was the harmless institutional fixture who remembered everyone's coffee orders and handed out laminated orientation packets. Let them overlook what I'd quietly accumulated over 16 years. The equity clause, for instance. Back in the early days, the founder offered shares instead of a raise. Most of the other early hire VPs laughed and cashed out within 2 years. I kept mine. Added to my stake quietly when opportunities arose. Documented every piece of it like I was preparing for a deposition, because somewhere in the back of my mind, I always knew a day like this was coming. By year 10, I stopped waiting for anyone to notice. I invested in myself the way the company never would. Hired a corporate governance consultant out of my own pocket. Paid for a leadership law seminar I described to people as a fishing retreat. My brother laughed. He wasn't entirely wrong. I was fishing, just for something specific. What I found was buried in my original employment agreement. A voting rights clause. A right of first refusal on governance restructuring, signed when the company had fewer than 60 employees, before any current board member was seated. It granted me co-signing authority on policy amendments tied to ownership thresholds. A clause the current board had apparently forgotten existed. I never did. I reinforced it over the years through documented approvals, internal legal reviews, and alignment with 2 long-tenured advisory board members I'd helped elevate into their roles. Neither was loud about their allegiances. They had no reason to announce them. The new CEO, Harold Voss, arrived in January with a press release and a LinkedIn quote about disruptive momentum. He shook my hand and said, "We need to move fast here, Ray. Speed is survival." I nodded. "I've been surviving at this company since before you knew what it made." 3 days later, his chief strategist arrived, Bryce Dunham, 31 years old, Harvard MBA. He strutted into the department head's meeting like he'd already read the ending and found it disappointing. His title was Chief of Strategy Implementation, and within 48 hours he'd renamed every department with an acronym that nobody requested. People development became HPX. Human performance and experience. My team looked at me with the expression you see on passengers watching a ferry drift from the dock. Bryce's philosophy could be summarized in 2 words: legacy overhead. If it predated him, it was suspect. He sat in his first budget review and asked, without irony, "What's the ROI justification for a full-time training director at this headcount?" I answered with documented outcomes and 3 years of metrics. He typed something and said, "Let's park this and revisit." Parking is how Bryce disposed of things he'd already decided to eliminate. My calendar started clearing within a week. Standing meetings got replaced with optional check-ins nobody scheduled. My budget requests went unanswered for 11 days. My Slack permissions were quietly downgraded. I noticed when I couldn't access the strategic planning channel I'd been part of since its creation. Nobody said a word, then came the email. Updated role scope. Signature required, arriving from Bryce's assistant at 4:57 on a Friday. The PDF was 2 pages dressed in neutral corporate language. Somewhere in the third paragraph was the sentence that mattered. My authority over training architecture, onboarding policy, and interdepartmental development protocol would be transferred to strategic operations. In plain language, they were hollowing out my role and leaving me the title as a courtesy. I read the document twice, forwarded it to my attorney. She responded in 11 minutes. Do not sign, call me Monday. I set my phone face down and looked out the window at the parking lot. Bryce's car was in its reserved spot. Mine was 3 rows back, same row it had been in for 16 years. I wasn't angry. I was awake. There is a significant difference between those two things. The repackaging started slowly enough that I almost missed the pattern. A monthly finance summary landed in my inbox and read like it had been run through a corporate word processor, twice, rinsed and dried on low heat. Line items that used to say things like leadership coaching, department heads, or compliance training vendor protocols were now buried under vague headers like operational support flow and intangible resources, non-client facing. Financial word soup. And the ladle stirring it, Bryce. The kicker was that my name was still all over the original approval chains. Every line now labeled discretionary or non-essential had passed through my hands at some point. Back when Quanta Peak still believed that developing people was worth more than slapping slogans on glass walls, a week later, I received a politely worded email from Audit Review and Risk, asking for clarification on several entries across 4 fiscal years. 4 years. As if I'd been stockpiling gold bars in the training room ceiling. They wanted details on one-on-one coaching sessions with an external leadership consultant and whether those sessions justified their ROI. One of the executives that consultant worked with now ran the Asia-Pacific division. Another had negotiated our largest vendor contract to date. But sure, let's debate the $2,100 invoice while Bryce was quietly approving 5-figure payments to a data synergy consultancy that, as far as I could tell, was a rented co-working suite, a beanbag chair, and a guy named Troy. I didn't answer the email right away. Instead, I started printing receipts, approval chains, meeting notes, slide decks with Bryce's name on projects built on frameworks I'd designed 2 years earlier. I found a quarterly budget deck in our shared drive, stripped of my formatting metadata, but featuring my original structure and talking points nearly verbatim. Someone had just replaced the footer and stamped his name on it. That weekend I drove to the lake cabin my brother and I co-owned. No Wi-Fi, no Slack, just me, 2 legal pads, and a thermos of bad coffee. I made a list of every budget Bryce had touched since arriving, cross-referenced it against legacy expenditures, highlighted every deviation, every renamed category, every omission. The pattern was unmistakable. He was quietly erasing institutional memory. Mine especially, replacing it with buzzwords and spreadsheets that looked clean on a dashboard but explained nothing about how anything actually worked. Then the doubts crept in. I reached out to HR casually, asking if they could confirm my current title in the org chart to resolve a minor confusion with an external partner. The woman on the line went oddly quiet before saying, "Let me check and get back to you." That kind of pause isn't about checking anything. It means something is moving that hasn't been announced yet. I called my attorney, gave her the update. She told me to preserve every version of every communication from that point forward. No deleting, no forwarding without copies. If they're building a paper trail, she said, you build one too, but smarter. The next morning I walked in and noticed my nameplate had been swapped. Not removed, replaced. The new one didn't say director. It said advisor, talent continuity. I hadn't been informed, not even a courtesy message. I laughed out loud, loud enough that the new intern near the printer startled and knocked his coffee sideways. I slid the old nameplate into my bag. Let them file that under non-essential. That afternoon I got the tip I'd been half expecting. I was in the stairwell heading to the roof for a call when someone said my name. It was Corey, a junior manager from the marketing team, someone I'd mentored during his first year at the company. He looked nervous in the specific way people look when they're about to say something they can't take back. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this," he said, voice low. He handed me his phone, a Slack thread, not screenshots, live access. Someone had forgotten to restrict channel permissions. It was a private strategy thread, One message read, "Let's finalize the package and schedule the termination before Q4 kickoff, preferably Friday. Don't want legacy noise dragging into planning." The message above it said, "Have we confirmed how to shut off access post-meeting? Wouldn't want RC to catch wind early." RC Ray Caldwell-Kari took his phone back without another word and walked away. I stood in that stairwell for a long time. Long enough to feel the specific cold that lives at the bottom of a betrayal that's been weeks in the making. They weren't just reassigning my role. They were preparing to delete me from the building. I drove to a quiet cafe across town that evening, not to decompress, to plan. I ordered a black coffee and opened my leather folio. Inside were 3 documents: a signed notarized voting proxy, a shareholder motion drafted by counsel, and a copy of the Monday board agenda I'd already confirmed with the chair. I texted him from the corner booth. "All ready, let's make it clean." He replied within a minute. "See you Monday, interim CEO." I finished my coffee, paid cash, left a good tip. Then I went home to open the drawer that had been waiting for this moment for longer than Bryce Dunham had been employed. The drawer key was taped behind an expired gift card in my wallet. I pulled it out, hands steady, slid it into the lock and twisted. The drawer opened with a soft metallic sound, like something that had been holding its breath. Inside were 7 file folders. The first was labeled Voting Rights, Legacy Clause. Inside sat the original agreement from 16 years ago, signed by the founding CEO and 2 original board members, one of whom now taught corporate law part-time at a university, the other who had retired quietly but never surrendered her voting stake. That clause granted me the right to amend and co-sign governance policies in lieu of cash bonuses. No expiration, no exceptions, no NDA. They forgot it existed. I never did. The second folder held shareholder holdings confirmations. My stake, 27.8%. Add in 2 advisory board members I'd mentored into their positions over the years, both quietly aligned with me, and we controlled just over 51%. Majority rule, silent, patient, legally binding. The third folder was the one Bryce had mocked without knowing it. He'd called my budget lines vanity expenditures. Those funds had paid for a corporate governance mentor, out of Washington, private sessions with a legal strategist who specialized in succession law, and a director certification program that walked me through exactly how to dismantle a hostile executive structure without raising my voice. Every dollar approved. Every dollar documented. Nothing arbitrary. Everything deliberate. The fourth folder held the revised bylaws. The chair and I had begun that draft 11 months ago, framed to the board as a routine modernization of outdated operational procedures. We buried the substance under language called governance redundancy mitigation, a phrase so dull nobody questioned it. The revised language redefined quorum procedures, streamlined interim appointments, and most critically, shifted executive oversight authority to any shareholder majority coalition formed in response to leadership misalignment. Guess what? One had just formed. The 5th folder held the Monday board agenda. My name was on line too, not as an attendee. As a presenting equity partner with motion rights under the revised governing clause, the 6th folder contained Nathan's greatest hits, now Bryce Dunham's. Every unauthorized spend, every consultant with a suspiciously convenient connection, every restructuring plan I suspected was borrowed wholesale from someone else's playbook. The 7th folder was empty except for a sticky note in my own handwriting. Phase 2. I closed the drawer and went to bed. Slept fine. Saturday morning I was up before 5. Reprinted everything, took the backup copies to be notarized at a UPS store that opened early. Wore the same gray jacket I'd worn the day the founder offered me that original equity package. Sentimental, maybe, but I wanted to carry the memory of who I'd been before any of this started. They called me in on Friday at 9:01. Of course they did. The invite was titled Q4 Strategic Realignment Touch Point, which is corporate language for a termination dressed in a blazer. I didn't bring a laptop, didn't bring a notebook, just a fountain pen I'd used for 16 years. Black ink, clean nib. Something about the weight of it felt right for the occasion. Bryce sat at the head of the glass conference room, like a man auditioning for a role he'd already given himself. Blue suit, no socks, ankles exposed like he'd personally defeated formal dress. HR sat beside him, Linda Pryor, arms folded, a printed packet on the table with my name in bold, the same font we used for offboarding. Ray, Bryce said, motioning to the seat across from him. Thanks for coming in. I didn't sit, he sighed with practiced patience. We've concluded that your role no longer aligns with our strategic direction. Effective immediately, your position is being eliminated. Linda slid the packet across the table. It made a quiet, deliberate sound. Paper meeting silence. Of course, Bryce added. This is no reflection on your contributions, but there have been questions around certain expenditures. Certifications that weren't disclosed in full. Consulting sessions billed as team development. He paused. We'll call it what it is. Misuse of funds. The company is being generous here. That last phrase sat in the air. Being generous, I looked at the packet. I looked at Linda. Then I uncapped my pen and signed. One clean stroke, no hesitation. I slid the packet back. Reached into my coat pocket, set my badge on the table gently, the way you set down something that has already served its purpose. I said quietly. I look forward to formally introducing myself at Monday's board meeting. The air in the room shifted. Bryce blinked. I'm sorry. What board meeting? I smiled. No teeth, just that particular kind of stillness that lingers. Linda looked up like she'd missed the relevant memo. Bryce looked down like he was searching for a page he hadn't read. I turned, walked to the door, and pushed through without another word. Outside the conference room stood two security officers. One was a man named Miguel, 7 years on the building security team. I'd written his internal promotion letter 4 years ago when he moved from the night shift to daytime operations. He held the door open and met my eyes. Mr. Caldwell, he said. Then lower. Meant only for me. This isn't right. You deserved better. I paused. I did, but I'll settle for what's coming Monday. He almost smiled. I walked past him, through the lobby, past the fake succulents, past the hallway where Bryce's vision for the future poster covered photos of people I'd trained, people already gone. I walked out of the building. No boxes, no backward glance. Just the cold autumn air and the quiet sound of my own footsteps on the pavement. Monday morning. The boardroom had coffee, muffins, the kind of deliberately casual staging that signals someone thinks atmosphere substitutes for preparation. Several board members were already seated by 8:55. The CFO chatted with the chair about a weekend golf round. Petra, the ROI consultant currently sitting in what used to be my office, adjusted her blazer repeatedly and nodded at things nobody was saying. Bryce stood by the presentation screen like a man who'd already written his own headline. Q3 was exceptional, he began, voice smooth with rehearsed confidence. Net revenue growth up 11.4%, churn reduced by 4.1%, and we've restructured our internal training architecture for leaner efficiency. Departmental overhead is down 36%. He didn't say my name. No reason existed in that room. I was the overhead. Looking ahead to Q4, momentum is building. New hires in the pipeline, vendor negotiations ahead of schedule. Before we continue, said Walt Ferris, the board chair, slow and measured, his voice cutting through the room like a draft from a window left open. There's one matter we address first. Bryce blinked. Which item is that? Walt didn't answer. He simply turned his head slightly toward the side door, and I walked in. No company lanyard, no badge. Just a dark tailored suit and a black folio under my arm. 3 board members straightened. Petra's jaw dropped, then reassembled. Bryce didn't turn to face me fully. He pivoted just enough to register my presence without admitting it unsettled him. Ray, he said, keeping his voice controlled. This is unexpected. Not for everyone, I said, stepping to the table. Setting my folio down the way you set down a hand you've been holding for 16 years. Walt cleared his throat. Per procedural update, Section 12C, effective as of today's governance revision, any equity partner holding a qualifying voting block may present a motion at the opening of session. He glanced at Bryce. That applies here. Bryce opened his mouth, closed it. I watched the precise moment his expression shifted as he started mentally running through every email he'd skimmed, every optional legal meeting invite he'd declined. Every clause he'd assumed was bureaucratic filler. In exercising that right, I continued, I'm filing a motion for immediate review of departmental restructuring outcomes, budget relocations, and executive consulting approvals in Q2 and Q3. Sylvia Crane, our general counsel, a woman who once told me my contract archive was the most organized she'd reviewed in 30 years of practice, nodded without blinking. Confirmed. Motion is within rights and procedures. Bryce smiled, the kind of smile people wear when they're stalling. With respect, I don't think we need to relitigate ancient spending history. We've moved forward. We're efficient now. Efficiency without compliance is a liability, Walt said, folding his hands. Let's continue. Bryce sat down, not willingly, because he finally understood he wasn't running this table anymore. I opened my folio. Inside were annotated copies of budget approvals, training outcome documentation, and board-ratified expense policies, all signed, all dated, all clean. I didn't perform. I simply distributed the documents the way I'd done 100 times in 100 rooms. Calm, direct, precise. Bryce skimmed one of the pages. Then I opened the second folder. Now, I said, let's talk about your consulting expenditures, specifically the allocation labeled Q2, Foreman Architecture Advisors. A $38,500 line item paid to Perform Group LLC. Walt narrowed his eyes. I don't recall approving that vendor. Neither did legal, I said, flipping the next tab, and neither did finance. I turned to Sylvia. Would you confirm? She leaned forward. The company has no record of Perform Group in our approved vendor list. It does not appear in compliance archives. I slid a printed page to the center of the table. It was from the Ohio Secretary of State's Business Registry. Perform Group LLC is registered to a Mr. Tyler H. Prescott. His email domain matches Bryce's LinkedIn recommendations. He also appears in photos from Bryce's 5-year Harvard reunion, tagged as a close friend. Bryce said, that was an arm's-length transaction. Tyler's email signature matches a domain created 4 days before the first invoice, I replied. He was paid via expedited wire, bypassing the standard review chain, and the performance architecture report he delivered. I tapped the last packet. 47% of it is lifted directly from a McKinsey white paper published in 2018. I've highlighted the matching passages in yellow. Nobody moved. Even the muffins seemed embarrassed to be there. Bryce stared at the table. Linda from HR whispered something to the colleague at her left. Petra was very interested in her own thumbnail. I set my pen down, folded my hands, looked at him steadily. You told this board I wasted company money on training, I said. What I was actually doing was preparing for your job. The chair laughed. Not a polite boardroom sound. A genuine, full-chested laugh that broke the tension in the room like a window going. He looked around at the other board members, then at me, then down at his watch. Shall we move to motion, he said. Bryce started to speak, but the room had already moved past him, just like I had. Walt closed the last folder with the patient deliberateness of a man who knew how to end things without unnecessary noise. No gavel, no raised voice, just the soft, precise click of a binder cover settling flat. We've heard the facts, he said, adjusting his glasses and scanning the room. We've reviewed the documentation. Unless there is meaningful opposition, I'd like to proceed with a formal motion. Bryce sat stone still. One hand gripped his water bottle like he was trying to compress it. Nobody looked at him. Even Petra, his most reliable echo in any room, had discovered something intensely interesting about her own hands. Motion of no confidence in CEO Bryce R. Dunham, Walt said, his tone clean and direct, based on findings of unauthorized financial disbursements, vendor misrepresentation, and failure to disclose conflicts of interest. Per Section 12C in our revised bylaws, this motion does not require a second from the presenting equity partner. Remaining voting members may now signal support. I stood still. There was nothing left to say or signal. One hand rose. Then another, the CFO. Sylvia, as a non-voting observer, nodded to confirm procedural compliance. 2 board members who had not sided with anyone publicly in years both raised their hands without hesitation. Walt lifted his last, the way you place a period at the end of a sentence that was always going to end that way. Sylvia leaned into the table. Motion carries. Majority reached. Bryce's lips parted. Wait. His voice was thinner now, stripped of its earlier performance. This can't be binding on this timeline. There has to be a formal review period. That review, Walt said, occurred over the past 90 minutes. An appeal then. Legal channels remain available. But as of this vote, you are no longer CEO of Quanta Peak Solutions. Bryce stood slowly. I have initiatives in motion. Q4 is 3 weeks out. You can't simply. He looked around the room, looked at Petra. She didn't return it. Looked at Linda from HR. She was writing something and did not look up. He looked at 2 board members who had nodded during his presentation 40 minutes ago. They were gathering their folders. He looked at me last. I said nothing. No smirk. No satisfaction performed for the room. Just steady eye contact. Long enough to let the moment settle, he turned toward the door. Said something under his breath that started with "this isn't" and ended in nothing. Then he walked out. Suit unwrinkled, posture rigid, but the certainty he'd carried into the room was gone. The boardroom held its quiet for a few seconds after he left. Not the uncomfortable kind, the earned kind. Walt cleared his throat. Per our revised bylaws, we are obligated to appoint an interim chief executive within 72 hours of a vacancy. I'd like to open that discussion now. Sylvia spoke first. We need someone with deep structural knowledge of the company, someone with compliance experience, long-term stakeholder relationships, and a demonstrated record of managing institutional complexity. The CFO nodded. Someone who knows where the problems are and where the exits aren't. No one said my name. There was no need for that. Walt turned to me with the directness of someone who'd been building toward this moment for 11 months. Ray, he said, would you be willing to serve as interim CEO while we formalize the transition? I didn't answer immediately, not because I was uncertain, because the value wasn't in the speed of the yes. It was in the fact that they were asking, not assigning, not approving by default, but genuinely asking the man they had finally understood had never left. Yes, I said. Effect immediately, Walt announced, looking down the table. Ray Caldwell will serve as interim chief executive officer of Quanta Peak Solutions. His equity position, tenure, and demonstrated operational leadership more than qualify him under the revised bylaws. Objections? No one spoke. That silence wasn't awkward. It was the sound of something long overdue clicking into place. Then the door burst open. Bryce, red-faced, pointed at me from the threshold. You can't do this. I built Q3. I cleaned up what she left. He caught himself, reset. What he left. You saw the reports. I delivered results. This isn't how companies run. Walt did not turn. You may address formal concerns through counsel. This meeting is concluded. She's bitter. He pointed at me again. He's bitter. He's not a visionary. He's not. I stood slowly, collected my documents into one clean stack, then turned to face him. Security is waiting, I said. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. Miguel was visible through the glass, arms at his sides, steady as a post. Bryce looked at him, looked back at the room, said something unintelligible that involved the words mistake and not over. Then he walked out for the second and final time. The door closed behind him. I waited until the room cleared. Until the board members had gone, the coffee cups abandoned, the projector screen dark. I walked down the hallway, past Petra's empty desk, past the poster Bryce had hung over the photo wall where photos of people I'd trained used to hang. I stopped at the office door, slid in my key card. The reader blinked green. The lock gave without resistance. Inside, his coffee mug was still on the desk, half-filled notepad covered in words like traction, leverage, gamify. All the architecture of a man who had confused vocabulary for vision. I sat down, opened the bottom drawer, retrieved the red folder I'd kept behind a stack of outdated onboarding guides. It was labeled in my own handwriting, Succession Plan Phase 2. I placed it on the desk, smoothed the cover. Thought about 16 years. About a clause in a contract most people assume expired with the founding era. About a voting majority, built not through power plays but through trust, documentation, and patience. Then I opened the folder and started reading.